My name is Zuri. I am 33 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful venture capitalist and commercial real estate developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Thanksgiving, they invited me to our historic family estate in Atlanta. I thought we were going to catch up. Instead, they expected me to cook and serve them. Between passing the turkey and pouring expensive wine, my sister Dominique, the woman who stole my husband 4 years ago, leaned forward. She smirked, flashing a massive diamond ring, and asked, "Still single, sis, my ex-husband?" Terrence laughed mockingly and added, "Hey, Leech, still the same, huh?" Then my dad stood up, clinked his glass, and said, "Good timing. I have something important to tell you." Their expressions changed immediately. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in an affluent African American enclave in Atlanta meant everything was about image. To the outside world, my mother Beverly painted us as the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. We were members of the right social clubs, attended the right church, and hosted the most lavish charity galas. But inside our sprawling brick mansion, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our home was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood was spent watching my mother groom Dominique to be a high society queen while treating me like an afterthought. My bedroom was pushed to the back of the house, away from the grand spaces where my parents entertained politicians and local celebrities. I was expected to be quiet, to stay out of the way, and to never embarrass the family name. That Thanksgiving morning started exactly the way my entire life had played out. I arrived at the family estate early, hoping for a warm welcome. Instead, my mother met me at the front door, looked me up and down, and handed me an apron. She told me to get straight into the kitchen to baste the turkey and prepare the collard greens. She said Dominique and Terrence were arriving soon, and she wanted everything to be absolutely flawless for her golden child. I took the apron without a single word of protest. I tied it around my waist and went straight to the kitchen. I chopped vegetables and stirred rich gravy while listening to my mother fuss over the table settings in the formal dining room. She polished the crystal glasses and straightened the fine china, constantly muttering about how important it was to impress Terrence. According to my mother, Terrence was a financial genius. He was the ultimate prize Dominique had rightfully claimed. 4 years ago, when Terrence and I were married, I was working 3 different consulting jobs just to keep a roof over our heads while he chased bad investments. I supported him completely and blindly. Then I found out he was sleeping with Dominique in the very bed I paid for. When the ugly truth finally came out, my mother actually took their side. She looked me in the eye and told me that Terrence needed a woman with real pedigree, someone active in the right sorority, someone who knew how to host a proper country club dinner. She said I was too focused on working and had forgotten how to be a supportive wife. So I packed my bags, left them all behind, and started my own business from absolute scratch. The loud sound of the heavy mahogany front doors swinging open pulled me out of my painful memories. Dominique and Terrence had finally arrived. I stood quietly in the kitchen doorway and watched their grand entrance. They were dripping in flashy designer labels. Dominique wore a bright pink dress, with a massive luxury logo splashed across the chest, carrying a handbag that cost more than a reliable car. Terrence wore a custom-tailored suit, looking every bit the arrogant finance executive he always pretended to be. My mother rushed forward with wide-open arms, squealing with absolute delight. She hugged Dominique tightly, praising her expensive outfit, and patted Terrence on the chest loudly, complimenting his amazing success. I untied my apron, washed my hands at the sink, and walked into the grand foyer to greet them properly. Dominique noticed me immediately. She looked me up and down, taking in my simple, unbranded silk blouse and tailored black trousers. A cruel smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She stepped forward and dramatically hugged me, making sure to press her left hand heavily against my shoulder so I could not possibly miss the massive diamond ring sparkling on her finger. "Well, look who it is," Dominique said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I am so glad you could take a break from whatever little desk job you have to make us dinner. It actually smells decent in here today." I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not frown. I did not glare. I just looked directly at her and said, "Hello, Dominique. It is nice to see you too." Terence stepped up right next to her, wrapping a possessive and arrogant arm around her waist. He looked at me with pure disdain. He told me I looked exhausted and suggested I should really try getting out more. Then he laughed loudly and asked if I was still living in that cramped little apartment on the wrong side of town. He called me a leech, claiming I had drained him emotionally during our marriage, and that he was finally thriving now that he had a real woman by his side. My mother quickly ushered everyone into the formal dining room, completely ignoring the blatant insults they just threw at me. She directed Dominique and Terence to the seats of honor near the head of the long table. My father Winston sat at the very head. He gave me a sad, tired smile. Winston was the only person in this massive house who ever showed me any real kindness, but he had spent 40 years letting my mother run the entire show. I took my designated seat near the far end of the table, placing my cell phone face down next to my water glass. As we started passing the heavy platters of food around the table, the brutal interrogation began. Dominique piled turkey onto her plate and looked down the long table directly at me. She asked the specific question she had been dying to ask since she walked through the front door. "So, Zuri, are you still single, sis?" She let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the room. "I mean, it has been 4 whole years. You cannot stay bitter forever. You really need to put yourself out there. Maybe find a nice guy who works at the post office or something. Someone on your actual level." Terence chuckled deeply and reached for the expensive wine bottle. He poured a heavy glass for Dominique and said, "Hey, do not be too hard on her, babe. Not everyone is built for real success. Some people are just born to stay at the bottom." He looked right at me with cold eyes. Still the same old Zuri, huh? Still angry, still jealous, still a total leech. My mother nodded eagerly in agreement, wiping her mouth gracefully with a linen napkin. She told me I should really listen to my sister. She said Dominique knew exactly how to build a legacy, while I only knew how to cause family embarrassment. She commanded me to stop looking so miserable and to be immensely grateful they even invited me to share this beautiful holiday meal. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my honor. I simply picked up my wine glass, took a very slow sip, and smiled a genuine smile. They had no idea who they were talking to. They had no idea that while they were busy pretending to be incredibly wealthy, I had actually become incredibly powerful. I did not work a small desk job anymore. I was the founder and chief executive officer of one of the largest venture capital and commercial real estate firms in the entire Southeast. I had spent the last 4 lonely years building an absolute financial empire. I knew things about their personal lives that would destroy their perfect facade in seconds. At that exact moment, my father Winston stood up slowly from his large chair. He picked up his crystal glass and tapped it gently with a silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound cut completely through the tense atmosphere in the dining room. He looked around the table, his face deadly serious. "Good timing," Winston said, his deep voice surprisingly firm. "I have something important to tell you. I need everyone to listen carefully because our family is facing a situation." The confident smirks instantly vanished from Dominique and Terence's faces. My mother looked at Winston with sudden sheer panic in her eyes. But before my father could deliver his heavy news, my mother slammed her hands hard on the table and stood up quickly, forcefully interrupting his moment. "No, Winston, wait," Beverly shouted, waving her hands wildly to command the room. "Whatever you have to say can absolutely wait. This is a day of deep celebration, and I refuse to let anything ruin it. We need to focus on the positive things today. We need to focus on real success." She turned her beaming face directly toward Dominique and Terence. She raised her glass high and proudly announced to the entire extended family that Terence had just secured a massive corporate promotion. She loudly proclaimed that he was officially being named Vice President of Vanguard Financials, one of the most elite wealth management firms in the country. She bragged aggressively about his massive new salary and his luxurious corner office. Then she turned to Dominique, practically crying with immense joy. She announced that Dominique and Terence were currently in escrow to buy a multi-million-dollar mansion in Buckhead. She described the estate in excruciating detail, talking endlessly about the marble floors, the sweeping grand staircase, and the highly exclusive gated community. She said they were finally taking their rightful place among Atlanta's absolute elite society. Dominique smiled modestly, pretending to be deeply humbled by the lavish praise, while Terence puffed out his chest, soaking in the admiration of the various aunts and uncles sitting around the table. They looked exactly like royalty holding court. They looked completely untouchable. I sat very quietly at the end of the table. I picked up my phone and turned the screen over. A highly confidential corporate email sat glowing brightly in my inbox. I read the bold subject line again, just to savor the sweet moment. I knew the real truth about Terrence's precious new job. I knew the actual truth about their glorious Buckhead mansion. I knew that the beautiful, shiny reality they were bragging about was actually a crumbling house of cards, and I was holding the match that would burn it all completely down. I locked my phone screen, placed it back on the table, and looked right at my sister. The real Thanksgiving dinner was just about to begin. Section 2, 1500 words. The dining room erupted into a massive chorus of incredibly enthusiastic applause. My aunts and uncles clapped their hands together loudly, their faces lit up with absolute adoration for the golden couple. Uncle Marcus raised his glass high in the air, loudly praising Terence for being a shining example of true Black excellence. Aunt Vivian leaned across the heavy wooden table, gushing endlessly over Dominique's flawless hair and the imaginary Buckhead mansion they had just described. They were completely mesmerized by the entire performance. My mother, Beverly, stood at the head of the table soaking in the praise, as if she had single-handedly engineered their entire success. She clapped her hands together, a wide, triumphant smile plastered across her face. Beverly turned her attention to me. The warmth in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the familiar, cold, authoritative glare she reserved solely for my existence. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly in my direction. "Zuri, get up right now and go down to the cellar," my mother commanded, her voice ringing out clearly over the dying applause. "Go fetch the vintage champagne, the expensive bottles your father bought for highly special occasions. We need the absolute best to properly celebrate your sister and your brother-in-law, showcasing true Black excellence today. Hurry up and do not drop the bottles on your way back up the stairs." I did not move a single muscle. I sat comfortably in my high-backed dining chair. I slowly crossed my legs, resting my hands neatly on my lap. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, my expression entirely relaxed, but completely unyielding. "I am a guest at this table today, Mother," I stated, my voice calm and perfectly leveled. "I am not your waitress, and I am certainly not the hired help. If you want the vintage champagne from the cellar, you are more than welcome to go down those stairs and fetch it yourself." A sudden sharp gasp rippled through the dining room. My aunt dropped her silver fork. My father, Winston, looked down at his plate, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. My mother's face flushed a deep, furious shade of crimson. Her jaw dropped open in absolute shock. She was not used to anyone defying her direct orders, especially not in front of her beloved country club friends and extended family members. She opened her mouth to scream at me to tear me down and put me back in my place. But Terence decided this was the perfect moment to assert his fake dominance. Terence pushed his chair back and leaned heavily over the table, trying to look incredibly intimidating. He let out a loud, condescending sneer, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a petulant, misbehaving child. "Come on now, Beverly, leave her alone," Terence said, his voice dripping with thick, arrogant sarcasm. "You have to forgive Zuri for acting out today. It is the holidays and she is just incredibly bitter. It is hard for her to sit here and watch a real successful relationship thrive when she could not even figure out how to keep a man." He looked around the table, making sure everyone was paying close attention to his grand performance. He smirked right at me. "I mean, look at her." Terence continued, gesturing dismissively toward my simple, elegant outfit. "She is probably still working some measly desk job, pushing papers around and struggling to pay her monthly rent. It is completely natural for someone at the very bottom to feel incredibly jealous when they are sitting in the direct presence of real success. Just let her pout in the corner." Dominique let out a high-pitched giggle, patting Terence's arm affectionately. She leaned her head against his shoulder, projecting the image of a perfectly supportive and submissive high-society wife. The extended family murmured in quiet agreement, easily swaying to Terrence's charismatic manipulation. They looked at me with varying degrees of intense pity and deep annoyance. I did not break eye contact with Terrence. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, allowing his arrogant words to hang heavily in the tense air. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my red wine, savoring the rich flavor on my tongue. Then I set the crystal glass down with a soft, definitive clink. I kept you perfectly fine when I worked 3 separate jobs to pay off your massive student loans, Terrence. I said, my voice projecting clearly and smoothly across the long dining table. The quiet murmurs in the room abruptly stopped. Terrence's smug smile faltered slightly, but I did not give him a single second to interrupt me. I paid for your car, I paid for your food, and I kept a solid roof over our heads, while you sat around chasing imaginary investments and pretending to be an elite finance broker. I continued enunciating every single word so the entire family could hear the absolute truth. I kept you extremely well. Right before you repaid my endless loyalty, by sleeping with my own sister, in the very bed that I bought with my own hard-earned money. The dining room descended into a state of profound, suffocating silence. You could hear a pin drop on the hardwood floor. My Aunt Vivian covered her mouth in shock. My Uncle Marcus stared at Terence with newly widened eyes. The ugly reality of their relationship, a reality my mother had aggressively tried to bury and rewrite for the past 4 years, was suddenly dragged out into the bright, unforgiving daylight. Terrence's face turned a mottled, angry shade of purple. He opened his mouth, searching for a quick comeback, completely desperate to salvage his severely damaged ego in front of the watching audience. He stammered, looking toward my mother for immediate backup. But Dominique was faster. She refused to let her picture-perfect narrative crumble so easily. She tossed her long hair over her shoulder, letting out a loud, theatrical laugh that sounded incredibly forced and brittle in the quiet room. "Oh, please, Zuri, stop living in the distant past," Dominique said, waving her hand dismissively as if I had just told a boring, irrelevant story. Terrence did not betray you. He simply woke up and realized his actual worth. He is a high-value man destined for greatness, and he realized he desperately needed a woman with real pedigree to match his potential. She sat up straighter, adjusting her posture to look as regal as possible. She looked down her nose at me, her eyes flashing with deep-seated malice and unearned superiority. "I needed someone who actually understands Atlanta's elite society," Dominique continued, her voice rising in volume. He needed a woman with an active membership in the right sorority, someone who knows how to host charity galas and network with important politicians. He needed a woman who represents true Black excellence, not some miserable college dropout who prefers to hide in the shadows and crunch boring numbers all day. You were never on our level, Zuri. You were just a temporary stepping stone until he found his real queen. My mother clapped her hands together once, vigorously nodding her head in total agreement. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Dominique is entirely right," my mother declared loudly, defending her golden child with aggressive loyalty. "Terrence is stepping into a massive vice president role at Vanguard Financials. He is going to be pulling in a $500,000 base salary. He and Dominique are closing on a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. They are the absolute future of this family's legacy. You have no right to sit at my dining table and bring up old, irrelevant history just because you are jealous of their incredible wealth." I listened to their frantic, desperate justifications. I watched them cling so tightly to their fragile illusions of grandeur. They were so utterly convinced of their own superiority. They genuinely believed their fabricated lies had successfully rewritten history. They thought their fake money and leased designer clothes shielded them from the brutal consequences of their actions. I uncrossed my legs and slowly reached into my black leather purse, resting on the floor beside my chair. I felt the crisp, folded piece of paper waiting patiently in the side pocket. I pulled it out, keeping it folded in half, and gently placed it flat on the pristine white tablecloth. The entire room watched my movements with intense, nervous curiosity. My father, Winston, leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the mysterious piece of paper. Dominique narrowed her eyes, suddenly looking unsure. Terrence glared at me, his chest heaving with barely contained anger. I pressed 2 fingers firmly against the folded paper and slowly slid it straight down the long mahogany table. It glided smoothly past the turkey, past the expensive floral arrangements, and came to a complete stop right in front of Terrence's porcelain plate. Terrence looked down at it. He hesitated for a brief second before reaching out and snapping the paper up. He unfolded it aggressively, prepared to mock whatever document I had presented. I watched the exact millisecond, the color completely drained from his face. His eyes darted frantically across the text printed on the page. His arrogant posture collapsed, his shoulders suddenly slumping forward. The aggressive, high-value executive facade instantly melted away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate fraud. "What is it, baby?" Dominique asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern. She reached over and tried to look at the paper, but Terrence quickly pulled it away from her grasp, crushing it tightly in his sweating fist. "Nothing." Terrence stammered, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly weak and hollow. "It is absolutely nothing. Just some stupid trash." I leaned forward, resting my elbows gracefully on the dining table. I laced my fingers together, resting my chin on my hands. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining my serene, terrifying smile. I looked right at the man who had destroyed my 20s, the man who was currently bragging about his massive corporate wealth and elite status, ensuring my voice carried perfectly to every single person sitting in that room. "I have a very simple question for you, Terrence," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a newly sharpened blade. "If you are so incredibly wealthy, and if you are about to close on a multi-million-dollar mansion in Buckhead with your beautiful high society queen, why was your primary credit card brutally declined for a $60 motel room on a random Tuesday night?" The silence that followed was completely deafening. I sat back and waited for his excuse. Terrence stared at the declined credit card receipt I had just slid across the pristine white tablecloth. The smug, arrogant facade he had been wearing all evening instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. He turned incredibly pale, a stark contrast to his dark, custom-tailored suit. Panic flashed wildly in his wide eyes as he scrambled forward, his heavy wooden chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. He lunged across the long dinner table and frantically tried to snatch the paper away before anyone else could read the incriminating text. But he was far too slow. Dominique, sensing his sudden sheer terror, reached out quickly and grabbed the paper right from under his trembling fingers. She held the crumpled receipt up to the bright chandelier light, her eyes narrowing sharply as she read the printed details. Her perfect high society smile completely vanished. She looked up at Terrence, her voice rising in pitch, demanding to know exactly what this cheap motel receipt meant and why his primary card was brutally declined for a $60 room on a Tuesday night. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, gently swirling the expensive red wine in my crystal glass. I watched the chaotic scene unfold with absolute, undeniable satisfaction. Terrence stumbled backward, stammering frantically in front of the entire family. He desperately tried to concoct a believable lie. He claimed it was a massive corporate mistake, a fraudulent bank charge, or a stolen credit card incident. He swore he was at a late-night executive board meeting. He waved his hands around, wildly sweating profusely, begging Dominique to ignore the receipt and blindly trust his word over a piece of printed trash. I did not let him escape that easily. I placed my glass down on the table and spoke loudly enough for the entire extended family to hear every single syllable clearly. "Terrence has not changed one bit," I declared, my voice echoing coldly through the grand dining room. "4 years ago, while I was breaking my back working 3 demanding jobs to pay off his massive student loans, he thanked me by cheating on me with you, Dominique. I covered his rent, I bought his groceries, and I funded his ridiculous lifestyle while he contributed absolutely nothing to our household. Now history is simply repeating itself in the most pathetic way possible. He is not a high-value corporate executive. He is a serial cheater and a complete financial fraud. He is currently cheating on you with a 22-year-old bottle girl who works at a downtown club." Dominique dropped the receipt onto her porcelain plate. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, a sudden loud sob tearing from her throat. She looked at Terrence with absolute horror, recognizing the exact same guilty, cowardly expression he wore 4 years ago when I caught them together in my own house. The extended family members gasped in unison. Aunt Patrice covered her face with her linen napkin, completely scandalized by the brutal revelation. Uncle Leon shook his head in deep, visible disgust. The beautiful illusion of their perfect, wealthy relationship was burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. Terence tried to cautiously approach Dominique, pleading with her to listen to his desperate, fabricated excuses, but she pushed him away forcefully. She screamed at him, her carefully constructed public image crumbling into a million pathetic pieces. She demanded to know if the accusation was true, hot tears rapidly ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. Suddenly, my mother Beverly slammed both of her fists aggressively onto the dining table. She absolutely refused to accept this massive public humiliation. She refused to let her beloved golden child be reduced to a weeping, betrayed wife in front of her elite country club friends, her esteemed church members, and her highly judgmental relatives. Beverly fiercely defended Terence, stepping right between him and Dominique like a loyal shield. "Zuri is a bitter, jealous liar," Beverly shouted, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face. "She fabricated this entire ridiculous story because she simply cannot stand seeing her older sister succeed where she so miserably failed. She is deliberately trying to ruin our perfect black family image just to make herself feel better about her pathetic, lonely life. She knows we have a major legacy to uphold in this community, and she wants to destroy it." My mother aggressively paced around the dining room, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. She forcefully ordered the extended family to completely ignore my factual accusations. She vehemently insisted that Terence was an upstanding, highly respected man in the affluent Atlanta community. She loudly claimed I had forged the motel receipt out of pure, unadulterated spite, insisting that a man of his incredible corporate stature would never stoop so low. She reminded everyone of how perfectly Terence always behaved at Sunday service, desperately using religion to cloak his massive sins and manipulative behavior. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Beverly screamed, pulling a sobbing Dominique into a tight, highly protective embrace. "Terrence is going to be the vice president of Vanguard Financials. They are closing on a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead next week. They are entering the absolute highest tier of Atlanta society, and nobody is going to drag them down. Not even a miserable, jealous sister who cannot manage to keep a decent man. She is just a college dropout who does not understand how real relationships work. Terrence just needed a woman with real pedigree, an active membership in the right sorority, and the ability to command a room. Zuri could never provide that." Beverly glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred burning in her eyes. She told me I was a complete disgrace to the prestigious family name. She said I was actively trying to sabotage the greatest real estate achievement this family had ever seen. She bragged once again about the massive Buckhead mansion, weaponizing the imaginary property to fiercely prove their undeniable superiority over my existence. She painted a vivid picture of their upcoming wealthy lifestyle, desperately trying to sweep Terrence's infidelity under the rug by blinding the family with promises of future extreme wealth and elite social dominance. She kept talking completely unhinged, claiming that successful men sometimes slip up, but a strong woman knows how to look the other way to protect the ultimate financial prize. She actually tried to convince my sister that a cheating husband with a massive corporate paycheck was infinitely better than a loyal husband with an average income. Her twisted values were finally entirely exposed for every single family member to witness. She cared absolutely nothing about her daughter's broken heart or shattered trust. She only cared about securing her own permanent VIP access to the wealthiest social circles in the city. Her desperate obsession with maintaining an impeccable high society illusion had driven her completely insane. I realized then that my mother would happily sacrifice my mental health, my peace, and even my basic human dignity if it meant she could brag to her superficial friends about a fake mansion. She was willing to let her own daughter be publicly humiliated and financially abused, all for the sake of a glossy photograph and an empty title. I felt absolutely no guilt for what I was about to do. I was entirely ready to burn her toxic kingdom down. I calmly listened to my mother scream her desperate, pathetic delusions. I watched her cling so tightly to the fake, heavily manufactured image of immense wealth and untouchable status. I leaned forward gracefully, resting my arms elegantly on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly at Dominique, bypassing my mother's frantic tantrums entirely. My voice dripped with absolute freezing ice. "About that spectacular Buckhead mansion," I said smoothly, my tone completely unbothered by the screaming happening around me. "What was the exact address again?" Dominique wiped her tears aggressively, fiercely defensive of her imaginary wealth, and eager to prove me wrong in front of everyone. She proudly recited the prestigious address, lifting her chin high to look down at me one last time, completely unaware of the trap she had just willingly walked into. I reached calmly into my black leather purse. I pulled out a heavy jingling set of keys and dropped them squarely onto her fine porcelain plate. The metallic clatter echoed sharply throughout the entire dining room, signaling the absolute destruction of their fake empire. I simply smiled, waiting for reality to set in right now. Terrence stared at the declined credit card receipt sitting on the pristine white tablecloth. The smug, arrogant facade he had been wearing all evening instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. He turned incredibly pale, a stark contrast to his dark, custom-tailored suit. Pure panic flashed wildly in his wide eyes as he scrambled forward his heavy wooden dining chair, scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. He lunged across the long dinner table and frantically tried to snatch the piece of paper away before anyone else could read the incriminating text. I was moving with the sheer desperation of a cornered animal, knocking over a crystal water glass in the process. The water spilled everywhere, soaking into the expensive linen napkins. But Terrence did not care. He only cared about destroying the evidence of his massive financial failure. But he was far too slow. Dominique, sensing his sudden sheer terror and completely confused by his erratic behavior, reached out quickly and grabbed the paper right from under his trembling fingers. She held the crumpled receipt up to the bright chandelier light, her eyes narrowing sharply as she read the printed details. Her perfect high society smile completely vanished in a fraction of a second. She looked up at Terrence, her voice rising in pitch, demanding to know exactly what this cheap motel receipt meant and why his primary platinum card was brutally declined for a $60 room on a Tuesday night. She shook the paper in his face, her manicured fingernails trembling with sudden rage. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, gently swirling the expensive red wine in my crystal glass. I watched the chaotic scene unfold with absolute, undeniable satisfaction. Terrence stumbled backward, stammering frantically in front of the entire extended family. He desperately tried to concoct a believable lie on the spot. He claimed it was a massive corporate accounting mistake, a fraudulent bank charge, or a random stolen credit card incident. He swore aggressively that he was at a late-night executive board meeting on that specific Tuesday. He waved his hands around wildly, sweating profusely under the dining room lights, begging Dominique to ignore the receipt and blindly trust his word. He looked absolutely pathetic, a far cry from the wealthy corporate titan he had been pretending to be just 5 minutes ago. I did not let him escape that easily. I placed my wineglass down on the table and spoke loudly enough for the entire extended family to hear every single syllable clearly. "Terrence has not changed one bit," I declared, my voice echoing coldly through the grand dining room. "4 years ago, while I was breaking my back, working 3 demanding jobs to pay off his massive student loans, he thanked me by cheating on me with you, Dominique. I covered his rent, I bought his groceries, and I funded his ridiculous lifestyle, while he contributed absolutely nothing to our household. I gave him everything, and he repaid my endless loyalty by desecrating my marriage bed with my own flesh and blood. Now history is simply repeating itself in the most predictable and pathetic way possible." I kept my eyes locked on my sister, ensuring she absorbed every word. "He is not a high-value executive. He is a serial cheater and a complete financial fraud. He is currently cheating on you with a 22-year-old bottle girl who works at a downtown club. That is exactly where your successful husband was on Tuesday night. He could not afford a decent hotel room because he is completely broke. He is drowning in debt, living entirely off your credit cards and playing you for an absolute fool. You stole a broke liability from me, Dominique, and you were too arrogant to realize you won the ultimate booby prize." Dominique dropped the receipt onto her porcelain plate as if it had physically burned her fingers. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, a loud sob tearing from her throat. She looked at Terrence with absolute horror, recognizing the exact same guilty expression he wore 4 years ago when I caught them together in my house. The extended family members gasped in unison. Aunt Patrice covered her face with her linen napkin, completely scandalized. Uncle Leon shook his head in disgust. The beautiful illusion of their perfect relationship was burning to the ground. Terence cautiously approached Dominique, pleading with her to listen to his fabricated excuses, but she pushed him away forcefully. She screamed at him, her carefully constructed public image crumbling into a million pathetic pieces. She demanded to know if the accusation was true, hot tears rapidly ruining her flawless makeup. Suddenly, my mother Beverly slammed both fists aggressively onto the dining table. She absolutely refused to accept this massive public humiliation. She refused to let her golden child be reduced to a weeping, betrayed wife in front of her elite country club friends and highly judgmental relatives. Beverly fiercely defended Terence, stepping right between him and Dominique like a loyal shield. She glared at me, her chest heaving with uncontrollable rage. "Zuri is a bitter, jealous liar," Beverly shouted, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face. She fabricated this entire ridiculous story because she simply cannot stand seeing her older sister succeed where she miserably failed. She printed out a fake receipt to cause drama. She is deliberately trying to ruin our perfect Black family image just to make herself feel better about her pathetic, lonely life. My mother aggressively paced around the dining room, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. She forcefully ordered the extended family to completely ignore my factual accusations. She vehemently insisted that Terence was an upstanding, highly respected man in the affluent Atlanta community. She loudly claimed I had forged the motel receipt out of pure spite, insisting that a man of his incredible corporate stature would never stoop so low. She reminded everyone of how perfectly Terence behaved at Sunday service, desperately using religion to cloak his manipulative behavior. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Beverly screamed, pulling a sobbing Dominique into a tight embrace. "Terence is going to be the vice president of Vanguard Financials. They are closing on a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead next week. They are entering the absolute highest tier of Atlanta society, and nobody is going to drag them down." Beverly was completely unhinged, doubling down on her toxic delusions. Not even a miserable, jealous sister who cannot manage to keep a decent man is going to ruin this celebration. Beverly continued, spitting the words at me. She is just a college dropout who does not understand how real relationships work. Terence just needed a woman with real pedigree and active membership in the right sorority and the ability to command a room. Zuri could never provide that. Even if Terence made a tiny mistake, a strong, high society woman knows how to look the other way to protect the ultimate financial prize. Men of his elite caliber have options, and Dominique is smart enough to secure her bag regardless of a few indiscretions. We are a family of extreme wealth and power. We do not let peasant behavior break our legacy. Beverly glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred burning in her eyes. She told me I was a complete disgrace to the prestigious family name. She said I was actively trying to sabotage the greatest real estate achievement this family had ever seen. She bragged once again about the massive Buckhead mansion, weaponizing the imaginary property to fiercely prove their undeniable superiority over my existence. She painted a vivid picture of their upcoming wealthy lifestyle, desperately trying to sweep Terrence's infidelity under the rug by blinding the family with promises of future extreme wealth and elite social dominance. She cared absolutely nothing about her daughter's broken heart or shattered trust. She only cared about securing her own permanent VIP access to the wealthiest social circles in the city. Her desperate obsession with maintaining an impeccable high society illusion had driven her completely insane. I realized then that my mother would happily sacrifice my mental health, my peace, and even my sister's basic human dignity if it meant she could brag to her superficial friends about a fake mansion. She was willing to let her own daughter be publicly humiliated and financially abused, all for the sake of a glossy photograph and an empty title. I felt absolutely no guilt for what I was about to do. I was entirely ready to burn her toxic kingdom down to the foundation. I calmly listened to my mother scream her desperate, pathetic delusions. I watched her cling so tightly to the fake, heavily manufactured image of immense wealth and untouchable status. I leaned forward gracefully, resting my arms elegantly on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly at Dominique, bypassing my mother's frantic tantrums entirely. My voice dripped with absolute freezing ice slicing through the chaotic noise of the dining room. "About that spectacular Buckhead mansion," I said smoothly, my tone completely unbothered by the screaming. "What was the exact address again?" Dominique wiped her tears aggressively, fiercely defensive of her imaginary wealth and eager to prove me wrong in front of everyone. She wanted to hurt me back, to prove that she had still won the ultimate prize. She proudly recited the prestigious address, lifting her chin high to look down at me one last time, completely unaware of the trap she had just willingly walked into. I reached calmly into my black leather purse. I pulled out a heavy set of keys and dropped them squarely onto her fine porcelain plate. The metallic clatter echoed sharply throughout the entire dining room, signaling the absolute destruction of their fake empire. I simply smiled, waiting for reality to set in right now. The heavy silence that followed was far more powerful than any scream. I watched her eyes lock onto the keys, realizing her worst nightmare. The heavy silence that followed was far more powerful than any scream. I watched her eyes lock onto the keys, realizing her worst nightmare. Dominique stared at the heavy brass keys resting on her fine porcelain plate. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Terence leaned forward, his face completely drained of all color. He recognized the custom keychain of the exact property management company they had been dealing with. I kept my voice incredibly calm and smooth, ensuring every single person at the dining table heard my next words. I told them I was not a lowly desk clerk. I explained that I was the founder and chief executive officer of a premier venture capital and commercial real estate firm. I told Dominique that I bought that exact Buckhead estate 3 months ago. I paid for it entirely in cash through a private corporate entity. I watched their minds desperately try to process the brutal reality. I explained that their ridiculous lease application did not just magically fall through. Their paperwork was aggressively flagged by my underwriters for highly fraudulent income statements. They were completely broke, faking their entire lavish lifestyle and trying to squat in my luxury property. I watched Dominique swallow hard, her throat bobbing as the absolute embarrassment washed over her. She looked at Terence, expecting him to fix the mess, but he remained completely silent and utterly paralyzed by the overwhelming shame of being publicly exposed. I reached into my purse one more time and pulled out a crisp, white legal document. I slid the formal eviction notice right over the roasted turkey and directly into Dominique's lap. I told her she had exactly 3 days to remove her cheap belongings from my multi-million-dollar property. The extended family gasped loudly in absolute shock. Uncle Leon shook his head in pure disgust, realizing the golden couple was nothing but a massive financial fraud. My mother Beverly completely lost her mind. The pristine image she had spent decades carefully curating was burning to the ground right in front of her country club friends and judgmental relatives. She slammed her fists violently against the mahogany table, knocking over a crystal wine glass. The dark red liquid spilled across the white linen tablecloth like fresh blood, but she did not care. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure rage. She demanded that I stop this ridiculous prank immediately. She yelled that I was maliciously tearing down the family legacy out of pure jealousy. When I simply pointed to the legal eviction notice, her desperation reached an entirely new level. She ordered me to let Dominique and Terence live in the Buckhead estate completely for free. She claimed it was my absolute duty as a successful Black woman to uplift my family. She said I owed my older sister a luxury lifestyle because family loyalty always comes first. I laughed out loud at her profound hypocrisy. I looked right into my mother's furious eyes and firmly refused. I told her that family loyalty is earned, not demanded by toxic abusers who only care about social status and fake wealth. I reminded her that they threw me out onto the street 4 years ago without a single ounce of mercy. I stated clearly that my charity does not extend to people who sleep with my husband and spit on my name. Beverly realized her aggressive commands were completely useless. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and she was absolutely terrified of losing her elite social standing. She decided to use the only toxic weapon she had left. She straightened her posture, attempting to look highly intimidating. A nasty, wicked sneer spread across her face. She lowered her voice to a harsh, threatening whisper that still echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. She told me I was going to sign the deed of that Buckhead mansion over to Dominique right now, or she would completely destroy my life. The extended family leaned in, utterly horrified by her vicious tone. Beverly proudly admitted her darkest secret right there at the Thanksgiving table. She confidently stated that 5 years ago she illegally accessed my personal files. She stole my social security number and my private financial information. She bragged about using my identity to take out massive high-interest loans from several different banks. She proudly confessed that she used hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen money to fund Dominique's extravagant lifestyle. She bought Dominique luxury cars, paid for expensive international vacations, and funded her exclusive sorority events, all while destroying my personal credit score in the process. She looked around the room, totally unashamed of her criminal actions. Then she turned her evil glare back to me. She threatened to go directly to the police tomorrow morning. She promised to file a formal report claiming I committed wire fraud and massive financial embezzlement. She swore she would manipulate the evidence to make it look like I stole the money for my real estate business. She smiled cruelly, telling me she would happily watch me rot in federal prison if I did not surrender my property to her golden child. The entire family sat in stunned, horrified silence. Aunt Patrice covered her mouth, utterly disgusted that a mother would intentionally frame her own biological daughter for a federal crime just to secure a fake mansion. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear or beg for my mother's mercy. I had spent the last 4 years preparing for this exact moment of ultimate retaliation. I maintained my serene, terrifying smile. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my silver tablet device. I placed it gently on the table and tapped the screen. I increased the volume to the maximum level and hit play on an audio file. My mother's unmistakable, arrogant voice filled the grand dining room. The crisp, clear recording was from a phone call she made to Dominique 6 months ago. The recording captured Beverly laughing hysterically as she openly admitted to the identity theft. She bragged in vivid detail about forging my signature on the loan applications to buy Dominique a brand new luxury vehicle. She joked about how stupid I was for never checking my credit reports and how easily she manipulated the bank representatives. The audio played for 2 full minutes, broadcasting her undeniable guilt to every single person in the room. I tapped the screen to stop the recording. I looked at my mother, whose face had instantly drained of all color. I calmly informed her that her pathetic blackmail attempt was entirely useless. I revealed that I had discovered the fraudulent loans 3 years ago when I started building my real estate firm. I explained that I did not confront her immediately because I needed airtight, undeniable proof. I told her I hired a highly expensive, ruthless forensic accountant to trace every single stolen penny directly back to her personal bank accounts. I meticulously cleared my own name and completely restored my credit score. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I told Beverly that I had already handed the comprehensive file of financial evidence, including the audio recording, over to federal authorities yesterday morning. I assured her that the authorities were actively building a massive criminal case for severe identity theft and wire fraud against her. Beverly began to hyperventilate. Her eyes darted wildly around the dining room, searching desperately for any sign of support. She saw only profound disgust and deep judgment from her wealthy peers and extended relatives. The brutal reality of federal prison finally crashed down upon her shoulders. She realized her designer dresses and country club memberships could not save her from a severe criminal indictment. She was about to lose her freedom, her reputation, and her entire fake empire in one single move. Completely terrified, Beverly turned frantically toward my father, Winston. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging deeply into his tailored suit. She begged her husband for immediate backup, demanding he use his influence to put me back in my place and force me to drop the federal charges. She cried loudly, commanding him to save their perfect family image before the police arrived. She insisted that he needed to remind me of my proper place in the family hierarchy, demanding that a father must always protect his household from rebellious, disrespectful children. She wiped her panicked tears and told him to fix the catastrophic damage I had supposedly caused to her flawless reputation. Winston slowly pulled his own arm away from her grasping hands. He looked at his wife with absolute unfiltered disgust. He took a deep breath, adjusted his jacket, and slowly stood up from the head of the table. He was finally ready to speak his absolute personal truth to her. Winston looked down at the woman he had been married to for 35 years. The heavy silence in the room shifted from shock over my federal fraud revelation to a terrifying, suffocating anticipation. Everyone at the dining table watched my father. He stood tall at the head of the table, his broad shoulders squared, projecting a quiet, powerful dignity that had been missing from this house for years. He did not yell. He did not scream like my mother had just done. He simply reached out and picked up his crystal water glass one more time. He took his silver spoon and tapped the glass. The sharp, clear ring echoed through the dining room again, recalling the exact moment my mother had rudely interrupted him before the meal began. "I have something important to tell you," Winston said, his deep baritone voice steady, but laced with a profound, unshakable sorrow. "I tried to announce this earlier today, before the bragging, before the lies, and before the absolute destruction of my family occurred right in front of my eyes. But my wife decided her fabricated stories about high society mansions were far more important than the brutal reality we are currently facing under this very roof." My mother, Beverly, shrank back into her wooden dining chair. The fierce, aggressive woman who had just threatened to send me to federal prison was completely gone. She looked like a cornered, terrified animal. She shook her head frantically, pleading silently with her eyes for my father to stop talking. But Winston did not look at her. He looked around the long mahogany table, making direct eye contact with Uncle Leon, Aunt Patrice, and the rest of our extended family members. "This house," Winston began, gesturing to the grand dining room with its high ceilings and custom crown molding, "is not just a building. It is a testament to our family legacy. My grandfather bought the original plot of land when black men in this city were barely allowed to own property in this neighborhood. My father built the first structure with his own two hands. I spent 30 years working 60-hour weeks to expand it, to renovate it, and to turn it into the sprawling estate you see today. I paid off the final mortgage payment 15 years ago. I made absolutely sure that this home would remain in our family for generations to come. I wanted it to be a permanent symbol of our hard work and our undeniable resilience." Winston paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The entire family leaned in, hanging on to his every word. I felt my own heart ache for the man who had always tried to protect me, realizing now just how much he had silently suffered under my mother's toxic reign. The air in the room was incredibly heavy, thick with the tragic weight of his impending confession. "This morning," Winston continued, his voice dropping an octave, "I received a phone call from Gregory Barnes. Gregory is the senior branch manager at the legacy bank our family has used for over 4 decades. He is a good man, a personal friend, and he broke official bank protocol to call me directly on my personal cell phone. He called because he wanted to give me the courtesy of hearing the news from him before the county sheriff arrived at our front gate to physically serve the formal paperwork." Dominique stopped crying over her impending eviction from my Buckhead property and stared at our father in absolute confusion. Terrence wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking extremely nervous about where this story was heading, his eyes darting toward the front door as if calculating his fast escape route. "Gregory called to inform me that this historic family estate is currently in active foreclosure," Winston declared, the devastating words falling like heavy stones onto the dining table. "He told me that the bank has officially initiated the final legal proceedings to seize the property. By the end of this month, this house will be auctioned off to the highest bidder, and we will be forcibly removed from the premises." A collective gasp erupted from the extended family. Aunt Patrice clutched her chest, completely unable to process the shocking information. Uncle Leon slammed his hand on the table, demanding to know how a fully paid-off family estate could possibly be facing a bank foreclosure. The family had always viewed Winston as the ultimate provider, a man of absolute financial stability and conservative spending. The idea that his home was being seized by a bank was entirely incomprehensible to them. "How is this possible?" Uncle Leon demanded, his voice loud and full of angry confusion. Winston, you told me yourself that you owned this land free and clear. You showed me the final deed years ago. We celebrated when you paid it off. How can the bank foreclose on a property that carries no debt? Winston slowly turned his head and looked directly at Beverly. The absolute disgust and deep betrayal in his eyes were incredibly painful to witness. He pointed a shaking finger at his wife, who was now weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Because my wife, Winston said, his voice trembling with years of suppressed rage and heartbreak, decided that our family legacy was completely disposable. She decided that maintaining a fake high society image for her country club friends was far more important than the roof over our heads. 2 years ago, without my knowledge, without my consent, and without a single ounce of respect for the sacrifices my father and grandfather made, Beverly secretly took out a massive second mortgage on this entire estate. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Relatives shouted in disbelief. Dominique looked at her mother in sheer horror. I sat quietly watching the devastating truth finally come to light. I knew my mother was financially reckless, but even I was shocked by the sheer magnitude of her criminal betrayal. Taking a second mortgage out on a fully paid-off family home without the primary owner knowing was a monumental legal and financial disaster. She forged my signature, Winston shouted over the noise of the family, forcefully silencing the room once again. She stole my personal financial documents, she hired a corrupt underground notary public, and she successfully forged my signature on the loan applications. She leveraged the entire appraised value of our family estate to secure a cash loan of $1.5 million. And she did not pay a single monthly installment back to the bank. For 2 entire years, she intercepted the bank notices, hid the warning letters, and diverted the phone calls. She let the debt accumulate massive interest until the bank finally pulled the plug this morning. Beverly sobbed violently, her face buried in her arms. She did not attempt to deny the accusations. The undeniable truth was completely out in the open, and her fake empire was reduced to absolute ashes. She had committed identity theft against her own daughter to buy luxury cars, and she had committed massive financial fraud against her own husband to secure $1 million loan. She was a complete and utter criminal, masquerading as an elite society matriarch. The family members were absolutely livid. Aunt Patrice stood up, pointing angrily at her sister. "You mortgaged the family home," Patrice screamed, her voice breaking with deep emotion. "You risked the very foundation of our family history. You risked everything Winston built, just so you could pretend to be richer than everyone else at your stupid sorority meetings. What is wrong with you, Beverly? What kind of monster destroys their own household for fake status?" Uncle Leon demanded answers. "Where did the money go?" he shouted, his booming voice vibrating off the dining room walls. $1.5 million does not just disappear into thin air, Beverly. Even with your ridiculous designer dresses and your constant international vacations, you could not possibly spend $1.5 million in cash without leaving a massive paper trail. What did you do with the money? Beverly continued to weep hysterically, refusing to answer. She shook her head back and forth, entirely unable to look her furious brother in the eye. The weight of her massive financial crimes had completely broken her arrogant spirit. Dominique jumped into the interrogation, entirely desperate to distance herself from her mother's catastrophic downfall. "Mom, where is the money?" Dominique shrieked, tears streaming down her face. "Tell them you hid it somewhere. Tell them you put it in an offshore account. You cannot just let the bank take the house. Where did you put the $1.5 million? Winston did not wait for his weeping, pathetic wife to answer the family's furious questions. He already knew the devastating, brutal truth. He had spent the entire morning demanding answers from the bank manager, tracing the fraudulent wire transfers, and uncovering the exact destination of the stolen cash. He knew exactly who had benefited from the destruction of his family legacy. Winston turned his body, slowly pivoting away from Beverly. He looked down the long mahogany table, his eyes locking onto the man sitting beside his golden child. He raised his hand and pointed a long, shaking finger directly at Terrence. "She did not hide the money in an offshore account," Winston declared, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. "She did not buy designer clothes with it, and she did not save it for a rainy day. Instead, she deliberately handed our generational wealth over to a con artist. The entire extended family turned their heads in perfect unison, following the precise direction of Winston's shaking finger. They stared at Terence, who was suddenly frozen in pure, unadulterated terror. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a custom-tailored suit. He pressed his back hard against his heavy dining chair, trying desperately to shrink away from the heavy accusatory stares of the entire room. She gave it to him. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a split second, nobody moved a single muscle. The entire dining room was frozen in a state of absolute disbelief. The sheer magnitude of my father's revelation echoed off the high walls. Then Dominique turned her head slowly to look at her husband. The flawless, confident smile she had worn all evening was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She stared at Terence as if she were looking at a complete stranger who had just broken into her home. Terence tried to open his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. He just sat there, sweating profusely under the bright chandelier light, his expensive custom suit suddenly looking like a borrowed, ill-fitting costume. He looked like a trapped animal desperately searching for a way out of a reinforced steel cage. Dominique stood up so fast that her heavy wooden dining chair crashed violently backward onto the polished hardwood floor. The loud smack startled everyone, breaking the trance. She lunged toward Terence, her perfectly manicured hands curled into tight fists. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure, unrestrained hysteria. She demanded to know if my father was telling the absolute truth. She grabbed the expensive lapels of Terence's jacket and violently shook him, screaming right in his face. She asked him how he could possibly take $1.5 million from her mother in secret. She demanded to know where the money was hiding, screaming that they desperately needed it to secure their massive Buckhead mansion and maintain their elite status. The beautiful, carefully constructed facade of the perfect high society couple completely shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Dominique was no longer the elegant, untouchable golden child of the family. She was a frantic, hysterical mess, publicly unraveling in front of the very relatives she had spent years looking down upon with extreme prejudice. She beat her fists repeatedly against Terence's chest, demanding answers, demanding her fake wealth back, and demanding he magically fix the massive disaster he had intentionally caused. She shrieked that she could not be poor, that she refused to lose her country club memberships, and that he had promised her a life of endless luxury. Terence finally snapped under the intense pressure. He grabbed Dominique's wrists forcefully and shoved her backward away from his body. He jumped up from his chair, his face contorted with intense rage and deep burning humiliation. He could no longer maintain the calm illusion of the collected, highly successful financial executive. The crushing weight of being publicly exposed as a massive fraud had completely broken his fragile, inflated ego. He pointed his finger right back at Dominique and began to scream with equal ferocity. He told her to shut her mouth and stop playing the innocent, clueless victim. He looked around the chaotic dining room, his eyes wide and manic as he loudly confessed exactly where the stolen money had gone. He wanted everyone to know that he was not the only villain in this twisted marriage. Terence revealed that he had blown every single penny of my mother's fraudulent $1.5 million loan on terrible, highly volatile crypto investments. He admitted he was desperately trying to multiply the stolen cash overnight, falsely believing he was a financial genius who could easily beat the complicated market. Instead, the unpredictable market completely wiped him out in a matter of weeks. The money was gone. All of it. Evaporated into thin air due to his sheer arrogance and profound stupidity. But Terence did not stop there. He aggressively turned the heavy blame directly onto Dominique. He shouted that he only took those massive financial risks because of her relentless, suffocating demands for a wealthy lifestyle. He told the entire shocked family that Dominique was a bottomless pit of absolute greed. He ruthlessly exposed the brutal truth behind their flashy, fake existence. He screamed that Dominique forced him to max out every single credit card they owned, just so she could buy exclusive designer handbags to flex on her superficial friends. He pointed aggressively at the expensive pink dress she was currently wearing and yelled that it was leased just like the luxury cars sitting in the driveway outside. He revealed that she constantly threatened to leave him if he did not pay her elite country club dues and completely fund her lavish international vacations to Dubai and Paris. He told everyone that Dominique cared significantly more about looking like a glamorous billionaire on Instagram than she cared about actual financial stability or building real generational wealth. He screamed that she drove him to absolute desperation, constantly comparing him to wealthier men and aggressively demanding a lifestyle he could never legitimately afford on his own average salary. Dominique covered her ears with her hands, weeping loudly, as Terence ruthlessly exposed her extreme financial demands to the judging room. She tried to deny it, shaking her head vigorously, but her weak protests were entirely drowned out by his furious, unrelenting confession. He told her she was a shallow, empty shell of a woman who only loved him for the fake money he projected to the world. He said she was exactly like her toxic mother, willing to destroy anyone and anything, just to maintain a pathetic, hollow illusion of undeniable superiority. The extended family watched the incredible meltdown with a mixture of pure shock and intense, undeniable fascination. Aunt Patrice reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. Uncle Leon immediately did the same. Within seconds, multiple relatives were openly recording the entire explosive argument on their cell phones. They did not intervene to help. They did not try to stop the vicious fighting. They simply documented the spectacular, deeply humiliating downfall of the once untouchable golden couple. My mother Beverly watched in absolute horror as the glowing camera lenses were pointed directly at her favorite daughter. She tried to step forward weakly, ordering the family to stop recording, but her voice was completely ignored by the crowd. She had entirely lost her power and influence in this house. The wealthy relatives she had spent decades trying to impress were now actively capturing her ultimate disgrace on digital video. Beverly knew exactly what was going to happen next. These embarrassing videos would be sent to every single group chat, every church committee member, and every single sorority sister in the entire city of Atlanta. Her pristine, carefully guarded reputation in the wealthy community was instantly and permanently destroyed. She would forever be known as the criminal mother who stole from her own hardworking husband to secretly fund a fake lifestyle for a broke, cheating son-in-law. The brutal social isolation she was about to experience would be absolute and totally unforgiving. Terence saw the phone cameras pointed directly at his sweating face. He realized his massive financial failure and his profound public humiliation were being permanently recorded for the world to see. The sheer panic in his dark eyes was instantly replaced by a desperate, highly aggressive arrogance. He desperately needed to salvage his shattered, bruised ego. He needed to prove to the entire room that he was still the powerful, untouchable corporate titan he claimed to be just 20 minutes ago. He straightened his tailored suit jacket, aggressively shaking off Dominique's grasping, desperate hands. He puffed out his chest and raised his voice, shouting fiercely and directly at the recording cameras to ensure his statement was perfectly captured. He screamed that he did not care about the lost crypto money at all. He yelled that $1.5 million was absolute pocket change to a man of his incredible intellect and elite status. He looked directly at my father, Winston, and laughed a cruel, deeply mocking laugh. He told my father that he was a pathetic old man for crying over a foreclosed house that he could not afford to keep. Terence fiercely reminded the entire room that he had just secured a monumental corporate promotion. He bragged loudly that starting on Monday morning, he would officially be the new vice president of Vanguard Financials. He screamed that his new base salary was a guaranteed $500,000 a year, completely excluding his massive incoming signing bonuses and lucrative executive stock options. He boasted that his new corporate power made him entirely untouchable and vastly superior to everyone sitting at the table. He turned his highly aggressive glare toward me, pointing his finger right at my face with intense malice. He told me that my little real estate victory meant absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of his rising career. He shouted that he was going to take his massive new Vanguard paycheck and march straight down to the Legacy Bank tomorrow morning. He swore to the stunned family that he would personally buy the historic estate out of foreclosure himself, easily paying the debt in full. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred burning in his eyes. He loudly promised that the first thing he would do as the new owner was to physically drag me out of the front doors by my hair. He swore he would permanently banish me from the property and finally kick me out of the family for good. He smiled a wicked, highly triumphant smile, entirely convinced that his new corporate job was the ultimate shield that would save him from this catastrophic disaster. He stood incredibly tall, breathing heavily, waiting for the room to bow down to his incoming wealth. He stood incredibly tall, breathing heavily, waiting for the room to bow down to his incoming wealth. Terence looked around the grand dining room, his chest puffed out so far. The expensive buttons of his custom-tailored suit looked ready to snap and fly across the table. He genuinely expected a round of applause. He fully expected my father Winston to instantly apologize, step down, and hand him the reins to our entire family legacy. He expected my mother Beverly to wipe away her panicked tears and loudly thank him for saving her from federal prison and absolute public disgrace. Most importantly, he expected me to shrink backward into my dining chair, completely terrified and entirely defeated by his massive corporate supremacy. He sneered directly at my face, pointing his index finger at me like a loaded weapon. "You will always be nothing but a pathetic peasant compared to me, Zuri." He spat, his voice echoing loudly and aggressively against the vaulted ceilings. "You think you are so incredibly smart because you got lucky and managed to buy a house in Buckhead. You think being a landlord makes you powerful. It just makes you a glorified property manager collecting rent checks from actual successful people. I am stepping into the absolute elite corporate world. I am going to be making massive financial decisions that move millions of dollars across global markets every single day." Terence began pacing back and forth behind his chair, completely consumed by his own grand delusions of untouchable power. He bragged to the silent room about the massive corner office. He was promised the unlimited corporate expense account he would wield, and the elite country club memberships that came automatically with his new vice president title. He looked at my father and loudly promised to write a personal check to save the historic estate from foreclosure by tomorrow afternoon. He promised to save the family from ruin, but only if they all agreed to permanently banish me from their lives. I watched the toxic, desperate reaction of my family unfold in real time. My mother Beverly immediately grasped at this brand new lifeline. The sheer terror of going to federal prison for wire fraud was momentarily eclipsed by her blinding greed. She looked up at Terence with sudden, desperate hope shining in her tear-stained eyes. She completely ignored the devastating fact that he had just publicly admitted to losing her $1.5 million in stolen cash on terrible crypto investments. She ignored the fact that he was actively cheating on her favorite daughter with a 22-year-old bottle girl. All Beverly cared about was the guaranteed $500,000 base salary and the fake social status it would provide her. Dominique stopped crying completely. She wiped the smeared mascara from under her eyes and looked at her husband with a renewed sense of arrogant calculation. She had just been violently screaming at him, ready to tear his eyes out for losing their fake wealth, but the promise of massive corporate bonuses made her hesitate. She straightened her posture, smoothing down her least designer dress, clearly preparing to stand by her cheating husband just to maintain her access to his incoming wealth. The extended family members kept their phone cameras rolling, utterly captivated by the chaotic, shifting power dynamics playing out right in front of the roasted turkey. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Terence for a single millisecond. I sat comfortably at the far end of the long mahogany table, watching him dig his own corporate grave with unparalleled enthusiasm. I reached out gracefully and picked up my heavy crystal wine glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive red wine, letting the rich flavor linger on my tongue before swallowing. I set the glass down on the pristine white tablecloth with a soft, definitive clink that somehow cut right through his aggressive bragging. "You seem incredibly confident about your new position at Vanguard Financials, Terence," I said, my voice projecting smoothly and calmly across the tense dining room. "You speak about the firm as if you already own it. But let us talk about high finance for a moment, since you are such a massive corporate expert. Do you actually know who the majority shareholder of Vanguard Financials is?" Terence stopped pacing abruptly. He rolled his eyes dramatically and let out a loud, deeply mocking laugh that sounded harsh and entirely humorless. He looked around the table, shaking his head, as if he were dealing with an incredibly stupid child who had just asked a foolish question. Of course I know who the majority shareholder is, you absolute idiot. Terrence laughed, gripping the back of his wooden dining chair. It is owned by Sterling Equity Partners. They are a massive, untouchable private equity firm based entirely out of New York City. They manage billions in assets. They are the biggest players in the game. You would know that if you actually understood how real corporate acquisitions worked, instead of just flipping residential houses like an amateur. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down his nose at me with pure, unadulterated condescension. But please, Zuri, do try to lecture the new vice president on how his own parent company operates. This should be highly entertaining for everyone here. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the icy, calculated smile of an apex predator watching its prey step directly into a steel trap. You are entirely correct that Sterling Equity Partners used to own Vanguard Financials. I began lacing my fingers together and resting my chin comfortably on my hands. They held a 72% controlling stake in the company for the past 4 years. They were notoriously ruthless, and they were the ones who originally approved your shiny new vice president promotion exactly 3 weeks ago. Terrence smirked, clearly believing he had just won the intellectual argument. But I did not stop talking. I raised my index finger, signaling for his absolute silence. However, as any truly elite financial executive should know, the market moves incredibly fast. I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly serious tone. Sterling Equity Partners quietly liquidated their entire controlling stake in Vanguard Financials exactly 8 days ago. They sold all of their shares in a highly confidential closed-door buyout to a highly aggressive, rapidly expanding venture capital firm based right here in Atlanta. The arrogant smirk on Terrence's face faltered slightly. His thick eyebrows furrowed together in deep confusion. He uncrossed his arms, his hands suddenly dropping to his sides. Dominique looked back and forth between us, her eyes widening with fresh panic as she sensed the sudden massive shift in my tone. Uncle Leon lowered his cell phone slightly, completely mesmerized by the impending corporate execution. The acquisition was handled entirely through a network of anonymous shell companies to prevent industry panic, which is exactly why lower-level employees and brand-new hires like yourself were not briefed on the structural changes I explained, enunciating every single word with brutal precision. But the paperwork officially cleared the federal regulators yesterday morning. Vanguard Financials is no longer owned by a bunch of faceless suits in New York City. It is now completely legally and entirely owned by Apex Horizon Holdings. Terrence swallowed hard. I watched the exact moment his brain desperately tried to connect the dots. The name of the holding company hung heavily in the suffocating air of the dining room. He blinked rapidly, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead once again. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps ask what that meant, but his vocal cords completely failed him. And as the sole founder, the primary financial backer, and the chief executive officer of Apex Horizon Holdings, I declared, locking my eyes onto his terrified soul. I am officially the majority shareholder of Vanguard Financials. I own the company you are bragging about. I own the office building you are supposed to walk into on Monday morning. I am the person who signs your massive imaginary $500,000 paychecks. I am your ultimate boss. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of deafening, heavy silence that only occurs immediately after a devastating bomb has detonated. My father, Winston, let out a sharp, genuine gasp of pure astonishment. Aunt Patrice covered her mouth with both hands, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of my revelation. My mother, Beverly, looked entirely physically ill, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as she realized that her hated scapegoat daughter was currently holding the absolute keys to her family's entire financial survival. Terrence stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the dining table. He shook his head frantically from side to side, completely refusing to accept the catastrophic reality destroying his life. "No," Terrence stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "No, that is a complete lie. That is a total fabrication. You are just making up stupid company names to sound important. Vanguard is a massive institution. You cannot possibly own it. You are just a bitter ex-wife trying to ruin my celebration. He looked frantically toward Dominique, desperately begging her to agree with him, begging her to validate his rapidly crumbling delusions. But Dominique was completely silent, staring at me with a mixture of profound awe and absolute gut-wrenching terror. She finally realized the depth of my power. She finally understood that I had spent the last 4 years building a financial empire specifically designed to crush them into dust. "I do not make up lies, Terrence," I whispered, my voice slicing through his panic like a scalpel. "I rely strictly on facts, on hard data, and on actionable corporate power." "You really thought you could sit at my table, insult my appearance, mock my intelligence, and brag about the very money that I control? You thought you could completely destroy my 20s and face absolutely zero consequences?" I slowly unclasped my hands and lifted my left wrist. I stared down at the glowing screen of my Apple Watch. The bright digital numbers illuminated the dark wood of the dining table. "I strongly suggest you check your pocket," I said coldly. I raised my right index finger and firmly tapped a specific contact on my watch screen. I had planned this exact moment for days. I had my newly appointed director of human resources working late on a holiday weekend, standing by on high alert, waiting for my direct signal to execute the final termination protocol. The entire family watched my finger tap the glass screen. I slowly lowered my arm and leaned back in my chair. 10 seconds. "Terrence," I announced into the dead silence of the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound in the grand dining room was the frantic, heavy breathing of my ex-husband as he stared at me in total horror. 5 seconds passed. Terrence's hands began to shake violently at his sides. 8 seconds passed. My mother closed her eyes, entirely unable to watch the incoming destruction. At exactly 10 seconds, the sharp, cheerful ringtone of Terrence's cell phone shattered the silence. Terrence flinched violently, crying out in sheer panic as the phone vibrated aggressively inside his tailored suit jacket pocket. He looked down at his chest as if the device had suddenly caught fire. He reached inside with trembling fingers and slowly pulled the phone out. The bright screen illuminated his terrified, sweating face in the dim room. He stared blindly at the caller ID flashing brightly on the screen. The bold, undeniable letters read clearly for everyone to see: Vanguard HR. The bright, undeniable letters reading Vanguard HR burned into the retinas of every single person staring at the small digital screen. The expensive cell phone continued to vibrate violently against Terrence's sweating palm, buzzing with the relentless intensity of an angry hornet. He stared down at the device as if it were a live, unpinned grenade ready to detonate and blow his remaining fabricated reality to absolute dust. The smug, arrogant executive who had strutted into this house bragging about a $500,000 salary was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, trembling fraud who suddenly realized there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. "Answer the phone." "Terrence," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand dining room. "And make absolutely sure you put it on speakerphone so the entire family can hear the good news." Terrence swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly above his tight silk collar. His eyes darted wildly toward the red decline button on the screen. He was desperately calculating his chances of simply hanging up, grabbing his coat, and running out the front doors before the ultimate humiliation could be finalized. "I strongly suggest you do not decline that call," I warned him, leaning forward gracefully and resting my elbows on the mahogany table. "If you send the head of human resources to voicemail, he will simply leave a highly detailed audio message. When he does, I will personally pull up my corporate administrative access, download the audio file, and broadcast it at maximum volume over every single Bluetooth speaker wired into this entire estate. You are going to hear this message tonight, Terrence. You can either answer it like a man or you can cower like a child. The choice is entirely yours." Dominique stopped weeping and stared at her husband, her chest heaving with sheer panic. "Answer it," she demanded, her voice shrill and completely stripped of its usual high society elegance. "Answer the phone right now and prove to her that you actually have this job. Prove to everyone that she is just a bitter, jealous liar." With a trembling, unsteady thumb, Terrence swiped the green button across the glass screen. He tapped the speaker icon, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped the device onto his porcelain dinner plate. "Terrence, a crisp, Deeply authoritative voice echoed out of the small speaker, carrying across the silent dining room with absolute professional mercilessness. This is Marcus Vance, the Senior Director of Human Resources at Vanguard Financials. I am calling to inform you of an immediate and permanent change regarding your employment status with our firm. Terrence opened his dry mouth, attempting to summon his fake corporate bravado, desperately trying to sound like the untouchable vice president he had pretended to be just moments ago. Marcus, listen to me. Terrence stammered, his voice cracking pathetically. I am currently at a private family holiday dinner. This is highly inappropriate timing. We can discuss whatever minor administrative issue this is on Monday morning in my new corner office. You do not have a corner office, Terrence, Marcus replied, his tone dropping to a freezing absolute zero. And you will not be joining us on Monday morning, nor any morning after that. Effective immediately, your offer of employment for the vice president position at Vanguard Financials is permanently rescinded. Your building access credentials have already been deactivated, and your corporate accounts have been thoroughly and completely terminated. A collective gasp rippled through the extended family. Aunt Patrice clutched her linen napkin against her chest. Uncle Leon stared at Terrence with wide, unblinking eyes. My mother Beverly let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, finally realizing that her golden ticket to elite society was rapidly disintegrating into thin air. What are you talking about? Terrence shouted, pure desperation bleeding into his rising volume. You cannot do this. I signed a legally binding employment contract. I passed all your standard background checks. You cannot just revoke a signed executive contract on a holiday weekend without facing massive legal consequences. I will sue this entire firm for wrongful termination. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my red wine, thoroughly enjoying the spectacular performance. I lowered my glass and spoke directly toward the cell phone resting on the table. He passed the standard background checks, Marcus stated smoothly. But he completely failed the deep forensic audit I personally ordered this afternoon. That is correct. CEO Williams. Marcus responded respectfully through the speaker, confirming my absolute authority over the entire firm right in front of my stunned family. Terrence froze, his eyes widening to the size of saucers as he heard the head of HR address me with my proper newly acquired title. He looked at me with a mixture of profound terror and absolute realization. We received the highly confidential financial dossier you provided us earlier today, Marcus continued, addressing Terrence once again. Our internal forensic accounting team spent the last 3 hours verifying the documents you attempted to bury. We found the massive discrepancies from your time at Sterling Equity Partners. We found the fabricated expense reports, the deliberately altered profit margins, and the highly illegal offshore routing numbers you utilized to quietly siphon corporate funds into your personal cryptocurrency accounts. Dominique let out a horrifying, blood-curdling shriek. She grabbed the edge of the dining table, looking at Terrence as if he were a monster. You embezzled money from your last firm, she screamed, her voice breaking. You stole corporate funds and then lost them in crypto. You are going to go to federal prison. Terrence ignored her, his eyes locked entirely on the cell phone, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He was completely trapped. The meticulous web of financial lies he had spent the last 4 years spinning was entirely untangled and laid bare for his new wife, his mother-in-law, and his entire extended family to witness. Not only is your employment offer permanently revoked, Marcus stated, delivering the final devastating blow with surgical precision, but as a heavily regulated financial institution, Vanguard is legally obligated to report any and all discovered evidence of corporate embezzlement to the proper federal authorities. We have officially forwarded your complete forensic file to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. No, Terrence begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic, broken whisper. Please, Marcus, you cannot do this. You are completely destroying my entire life. I will pay the money back. I will find a way to make it right. Do not send those files to the SEC. You are officially blacklisted from the entire financial sector, Terrence, Marcus said, completely ignoring his pathetic pleading. You will never legally work in high finance, wealth management, or corporate banking ever again. Do not attempt to contact this office, and do not attempt to contact any of our employees. Have a good evening. The line clicked loudly, followed by the dull, flat drone of the dial tone. The silence that descended upon the grand dining room was suffocating. It was heavier than before, entirely devoid of the tension of anticipation. This was the deafening silence of absolute, undeniable destruction. In exactly 20 minutes, Terence had been stripped of everything. His fake wealth was exposed. His leased luxury cars and imaginary Buckhead mansion were ripped away. His elite corporate job was vaporized. His professional reputation was permanently destroyed, and he was now facing severe federal criminal charges that would undoubtedly end with him sitting in a concrete prison cell. Terence dropped the phone. It hit the porcelain dinner plate with a sharp clatter, the screen cracking instantly upon impact. He stood completely still, his broad shoulders slumped forward, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven jerks. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to ash. Dominique buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The glamorous, untouchable high society life she had violently stolen from me was nothing but an illusion built on stolen credit cards and federal crimes. She was married to a broke, blacklisted felon. My mother Beverly sat frozen in her high-backed chair, staring blankly at the spilled red wine on the tablecloth, utterly unable to comprehend the catastrophic social ruin that was about to rain down upon her. I sat perfectly still, maintaining my calm, icy demeanor. I looked right into Terrence's bloodshot eyes, allowing a slow, triumphant smile to spread across my face. It was the exact same condescending, arrogant smile he had given me 4 years ago when he walked out of my house arm in arm with my sister. "It seems you will not be buying this historic estate out of foreclosure after all." "Terrence," I said softly, my voice dripping with lethal satisfaction. "Perhaps you should ask your 22-year-old bottle girl if you can sleep on her couch tonight, because you certainly will not be sleeping in my property." Something inside Terrence's brain completely shattered. The absolute humiliation, the loss of his fake empire, the impending federal prison sentence, and the sight of my victorious smile finally pushed him over the psychological edge. The last remaining threads of his sanity violently snapped. A guttural, animalistic roar tore its way out of his throat, echoing terrifyingly against the high, vaulted ceilings of the dining room. His eyes dilated with pure, unadulterated, murderous rage. He completely abandoned any remaining pretense of being a civilized human being. Terrence lunged forward like a wild beast. He scrambled directly onto the top of the long mahogany dining table, his heavy leather dress shoes crushing the expensive floral centerpieces into pulp. He kicked blindly, sending fine porcelain plates, heavy silver platters, and crystal wine glasses flying violently across the room. Cranberry sauce and hot turkey gravy splattered across the pristine white walls. Extended family members screamed in sheer terror, pushing their chairs backward and scrambling frantically away from the table to escape his path of destruction. He scrambled on his hands and knees across the ruined tablecloth, his face contorted into a mask of pure, violent hatred, reaching his large hands directly toward my throat. He intended to kill me right there in the dining room. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I simply sat back in my chair, entirely unbothered, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Before Terrence could even come within 3 feet of me, a massive, unexpected force slammed violently into his side. My father, Winston, the quiet, exhausted patriarch, who had spent years silently suffering under my mother's toxic reign. The man who had just watched his generational home fall into foreclosure because of this very fraud, moved with a speed and ferocity that defied his age. Winston had reached his absolute limit. He was not going to let this criminal lay a single finger on his daughter. Winston launched himself into the air and tackled Terrence right off the edge of the dining table. The impact was brutal. The two men crashed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, taking 2 heavy wooden dining chairs down with them in a loud, bone-rattling collision. Terrence gasped for air, the wind completely knocked out of his lungs by the fierce tackle. Before the younger man could even attempt to recover or fight back, Winston was already moving. Fueled by years of suppressed rage and the desperate need to finally protect his family. My father grabbed Terrence roughly by the collar of his ruined, gravy-stained custom suit. "Get your hands off my daughter," Winston roared, his deep voice shaking the very foundation of the house. Winston hauled Terrence up by his collar and began dragging him forcefully across the floor. Terrence kicked and thrashed weakly, but my father's grip was like iron. Winston dragged the disgraced executive out of the dining room down the long hallway and straight into the grand marble foyer. My father reached out with his free hand and grabbed the brass handle of the heavy mahogany front doors. He threw them wide open. Outside, a massive, violent thunderstorm had finally broken over the city of Atlanta. The sky was pitch black, illuminated only by bright, jagged flashes of lightning. Freezing torrential rain poured down onto the circular driveway, creating deep, rushing puddles of muddy water. With one final massive heave, Winston lifted Terrence off his feet and physically threw him out the front door. Terrence flew through the air and landed hard on his hands and knees, right in the middle of the freezing, pouring rain. His expensive suit was instantly soaked through, plastered tightly against his shivering skin. He looked up, his face covered in mud and rainwater, looking absolutely pathetic. "Do not ever step foot on this property again," Winston bellowed over the deafening crash of thunder. My father slammed the heavy double doors completely shut, throwing the deadbolt with a loud final click, permanently locking the fraudulent golden child out in the freezing storm. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a resounding metallic snap, permanently sealing the grand mahogany doors. Immediately, wet, frantic fists began pounding aggressively against the thick wood from the outside. Terrence was screaming at the top of his lungs, his desperate voice heavily muffled by the howling wind and the torrential Atlanta rain. He begged relentlessly to be let back inside, swearing he would fix everything, demanding that someone open the door and save him from the freezing storm. Winston did not even flinch. My father simply turned his broad back to the front doors, completely abandoning his fraudulent son-in-law to the unforgiving elements. He walked slowly back toward the dining room, his posture radiating the absolute exhaustion of a man who had finally expelled a toxic poison from his home. Inside the ruined dining room, the brutal reality of the situation finally crushed Dominique's remaining sanity. The glamorous, untouchable high society facade she had worn all evening shattered entirely. She collapsed onto her bare knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. The spilled cranberry sauce and crushed floral arrangements stained her least bright pink designer dress, but she no longer cared about her aesthetic. She crawled over to our mother, grabbing the hem of Beverly's expensive skirt, sobbing uncontrollably. Her perfect, expensive makeup ran down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers. Dominique begged Beverly to use her elite country club connections to call the bank manager to magically fix the catastrophic disaster that had just completely destroyed her fake perfect life. She wailed that she could not be married to a blacklisted broke felon. She shrieked that she absolutely refused to be homeless. Beverly looked down at her weeping golden child. For the very first time in her incredibly arrogant life, my mother had absolutely no solutions. The powerful women at the country club could not save her from federal wire fraud. Her esteemed sorority sisters would instantly shun her the second the news of her stolen mortgage broke. The Legacy Bank was actively foreclosing on her historic estate because she had committed severe financial crimes against her own husband. She was about to be completely homeless, permanently stripped of her fake wealth, her stolen money, and her carefully curated social standing. Pure, unadulterated panic seized her features. Her eyes darted wildly around the dining room, searching the faces of our extended family members for any sign of financial rescue. Uncle Leon looked away in deep disgust. Aunt Patrice crossed her arms, entirely unwilling to offer a single dime to a woman who had just confessed to identity theft. Then Beverly's desperate, frantic eyes slowly locked directly onto me. She remembered the multi-million-dollar venture capital firm I had just exposed. She remembered the elite Buckhead mansion I had purchased completely in cash. She suddenly realized that the miserable scapegoat daughter she had mocked all evening was actually the wealthiest, most powerful person in the entire room. Beverly released her grip on Dominique and practically crawled across the dining room floor toward my chair. She completely abandoned every single ounce of her supposed high society dignity. She fell to her knees right beside me, clasping her manicured hands together in a pathetic posture of desperate prayer. Her eyes brimmed with manufactured, highly manipulative tears. She looked up at me, attempting to summon the maternal warmth she had denied me for my entire existence. "Zuri, my beautiful, successful daughter," Beverly cried, her voice shaking with toxic desperation. "You have to help us. You have to save this family. I know we have had our minor disagreements in the past, but we are blood. You are a highly successful black woman now. You have built an incredible empire. It is your absolute moral duty to lift up your family in our darkest hour. You cannot let your own mother and your sister end up sleeping on the dangerous streets of Atlanta. She reached out trying to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled it away, resting my arms elegantly on the table. Beverly did not stop her frantic begging. Generational wealth means absolutely nothing if you do not share it with the people who raised you. Beverly continued employing the heaviest, most toxic guilt she could possibly muster. You have millions of dollars, Zuri. You just proved it to everyone. I am begging you, please write a check to the Legacy Bank tomorrow morning. Pay off the $1.5 million debt I owe them. Save this historic estate from the public auction block. You have the ultimate power to fix this entire mess with a single signature. Prove to everyone here that you are the bigger person. Prove that you embody true Black excellence by saving your mother's home. The entire extended family sat in absolute suffocated silence, waiting to see if the lifelong emotional manipulation would finally break my resolve. They watched to see if the dutiful abused daughter would cave to the immense pressure and open her massive checkbook to rescue her abusers. I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman who had birthed me. I searched my heart for a single shred of pity for any lingering trace of daughterly obligation. I found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened steel. I calmly laced my fingers together. My voice was completely steady, smooth, and chillingly precise, cutting right through her frantic, manipulative weeping. "You want to talk to me about familial duty, Mother?" I asked, my tone dripping with freezing ice. "You want to invoke the sacred concept of family loyalty now that you are staring down the barrel of a federal indictment and a bank foreclosure. Let us talk about your version of family loyalty." Beverly swallowed hard, her fake tears faltering as she heard the absolute lack of mercy in my voice. "I want you to remember the summer I was 16 years old." I began enunciating every single word so the entire dining room could hear the unvarnished truth. "I went completely hungry for 3 straight weeks. I ate stale crackers from the school cafeteria because you deliberately spent the entire monthly grocery budget on Dominique's ridiculously expensive pageant dresses. You looked at my starving face and told me that my sister's beauty required significant financial sacrifices and that I needed to learn how to fast." Aunt Patrice gasped loudly, covering her mouth in sheer horror. Dominique stopped crying for a second, looking away in deep shame. "I want you to remember the emotional abuse." I continued, leaning forward slightly to lock my eyes directly onto Beverly's terrified face. "I want you to remember the constant daily comparisons. You called me a permanent disappointment, an ugly duckling, a miserable failure, all while I was breaking my back, working 3 demanding jobs just to keep the electricity turned on in my apartment. You stole my highly confidential social security number. You completely destroyed my personal credit score to buy luxury vehicles for the very daughter who is currently weeping on this floor. You actively committed identity theft against your own flesh and blood just to maintain your superficial country club status." Beverly opened her mouth to interrupt, to offer another pathetic, fabricated excuse, but I immediately raised my index finger, demanding absolute silence. She snapped her mouth shut, trembling under my commanding gaze. "And most importantly," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly register, "I want you to remember the exact moment you helped pack my bags 4 years ago. I came to you completely shattered, crying, because I had just caught Terrence sleeping with Dominique in my own bed. I begged my mother for comfort. Instead, you told me that Terrence needed a woman with real pedigree. You helped pack my belongings into garbage bags. You physically threw me out of this very house, forcing me onto the cold streets so Terrence and Dominique could comfortably carry on their disgusting, toxic affair in my old childhood bedroom." The heavy silence in the grand dining room was completely deafening. The horrific reality of Beverly's decades of abuse was entirely laid bare. There was absolutely nowhere left for her to hide. "You showed me absolutely zero mercy. When I was at rock bottom," I declared, sitting up perfectly straight, radiating absolute, undeniable power. "My massive success belongs entirely to me. I built my venture capital firm from the absolute dirt you forced me into. I survived your emotional terrorism. I survived your financial abuse, and I survived your profound betrayal. My charity does not extend to criminals, it does not extend to cheaters, and it absolutely does not extend to toxic mothers who weaponize guilt only when they have run out of stolen money. I will not write you a single check. Beverly's face contorted with sheer, unadulterated panic as her ultimate guilt tactics failed completely. The realization that she was not going to be rescued finally hit her. She wailed loudly, grabbing the edge of the mahogany dining table. "They are going to throw me out!" Beverly screamed, hyperventilating as the terror consumed her. "The bank manager said the sheriff is coming. They are going to take this house by Monday morning. I have absolutely nowhere to go, Zuri. You cannot let the bank take our historic home." I leaned forward gracefully, my expression freezing into a mask of pure victorious ice. I looked down at her frantic red face. "Stop crying and wipe your ruined makeup off your face, Beverly," I commanded smoothly, entirely unbothered by her hysterics. Beverly sniffled, looking up at me with profound confusion. "The Legacy Bank is absolutely not taking this historic family estate on Monday morning," I stated clearly. Beverly paused. A sudden, massive, greedy spark of hope reignited instantly in her tear-stained eyes. Her panic vanished, replaced by an overwhelming wave of arrogant relief. She actually smiled fully, preparing to stand up and loudly thank me for finally doing my proper duty. Completely convinced I had just caved to her demands and agreed to save her precious kingdom, I maintained my terrifying calm composure, refusing to break eye contact. "The bank is not taking the house," I repeated softly, savoring the exact moment of her impending destruction, "because I already paid the $1.5 million debt completely in full yesterday afternoon." Beverly let out a loud, joyous gasp of pure relief. She threw her hands up in the air, praising my family loyalty, shouting to the entire room that she knew her successful daughter would never truly abandon her. Dominique let out a wet laugh of relief, thinking their luxurious lifestyle was completely salvaged. But my mother's loud, arrogant celebration died violently in her throat the exact second I reached calmly into my black leather purse and pulled out a thick manila legal folder. I placed the heavy manila folder flat on the polished mahogany table, right next to my untouched crystal wine glass. The loud, definitive smack of the thick paper hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent dining room. My mother's joyous, arrogant celebration died violently in her throat. Her arms, which had been raised in a triumphant posture of victory, slowly lowered to her sides. The overwhelming relief that had just washed over her face instantly morphed back into deep, paralyzing suspicion. I kept my movements incredibly slow and deliberate. I flipped open the heavy cover of the folder and withdrew a crisp, newly printed legal document. It featured the official raised gold seal of the county clerk's office and a series of bold, undeniable signatures across the bottom line. I held the document up under the bright glow of the crystal chandelier, ensuring the thick black text was fully illuminated for everyone at the table to see. "I did not write a charitable check to your legacy bank to bail you out of your massive financial crimes, Mother," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing authority. "I am a highly successful venture capitalist. I do not ever throw millions of dollars into the black hole of your terrible selfish decisions. I did not pay off your mortgage out of a twisted sense of familial duty." Beverly stared at the gold seal on the paper, her breath catching in her throat. Her manicured hands began to shake violently against the white linen tablecloth. When a property of this magnitude goes into active foreclosure due to severe default, the bank quietly auctions off the distressed debt to private investment firms to recoup their immediate losses. I explained, breaking down the brutal financial reality with surgical precision. Apex Horizon Holdings was the highest bidder at that private commercial auction. We acquired the entire debt portfolio for this specific property exactly 2 days ago. I lowered the document slightly and looked directly into my mother's terrified wide eyes. "I am not your savior, Beverly. I am your new landlord. And as of yesterday morning, I am the sole legal owner of this entire historic family estate." The dining room erupted into absolute pandemonium. Aunt Patrice let out a sharp, breathless scream, clutching her chest as if she were having a physical reaction to the news. Uncle Leon leaned so far forward over the table that his tie dipped directly into his untouched gravy, completely ignoring the mess as he stared at the legal deed in my hand. Dominique collapsed backward into her heavy wooden chair, her face draining of all remaining color. She looked back and forth between the eviction notice for the Buckhead mansion sitting in her lap and the new property deed resting in my hand. The realization that I legally owned every single roof she had ever tried to claim as her own hit her like a speeding freight train. My mother snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged forward aggressively, her hands reaching across the table in a desperate, frantic attempt to snatch the legal deed right out of my grip. I calmly pulled the document out of her reach and slipped it safely back into the protective manila folder. "You cannot do this!" Beverly screamed, her voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "This is my house. I have lived here for 30 years. I decorated every single room. I hosted every single holiday. You cannot just swoop in and steal my property from me. The courts will not allow it. You stole it from yourself the exact second you forged my father's signature to fund your fake high society lifestyle." I fired back, my voice rising to easily overpower her frantic screaming. "You leveraged this entire property to buy designer handbags and leased luxury vehicles for a daughter who could not even afford a cheap motel room. You lost the house, Beverly. I simply bought it." I stood up slowly from my chair, my black trousers brushing against the edge of the mahogany table. I looked down at my mother and my older sister, the two women who had spent decades actively tearing down my self-worth, mocking my ambitions, and prioritizing superficial wealth over basic human decency. They looked absolutely pathetic, stripped entirely of their designer armor and fake prestige. "You currently have no active lease agreement with Apex Horizon Holdings," I announced, formally addressing them both with the cold, detached professionalism of a corporate executive dealing with hostile trespassers. "Because this property was acquired through a commercial foreclosure auction, and because the previous mortgage was obtained through documented federal wire fraud, you have absolutely zero legal tenant protections. You are currently trespassing on my private property." Dominique burst into fresh, hysterical tears. She covered her face with her shaking hands, her carefully styled hair falling wildly around her shoulders. "Where are we supposed to go?" Dominique wailed, looking up at me with profound, desperate terror. "Terrence is blacklisted and broke. The bank accounts are completely empty. We have absolutely no money left, Zuri. We cannot sleep on the streets. You should have thought about your housing options before you slept with my husband in my own bed 4 years ago," I replied coldly, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for her manufactured tears. "I survived being thrown onto the street because I possess actual intelligence and undeniable resilience. You two have relied solely on manipulation and theft. I suggest you call one of your wealthy country club friends or your elite sorority sisters for a spare couch, because you are officially evicted from this estate, tonight." Beverly let out a guttural, terrifying shriek of pure denial. She turned her wild, panicked eyes toward my father. Winston had been sitting quietly at the head of the table throughout my entire revelation, watching the complete destruction of his toxic wife with an unreadable stoic expression. "Winston, do something!" Beverly commanded, her voice dropping into the harsh, demanding tone she had successfully used to control him for over 3 decades. "Stop your daughter right now. Tell her she cannot throw her own mother out into the freezing rain. Tell her to respect her elders and transfer this deed back to us. Put her in her place." The entire extended family held their collective breath, waiting to see if the traditional, exhausted patriarch would finally cave to his wife's aggressive demands. They waited to see if Winston would fall back into his old familiar patterns of keeping the peace at all costs. Winston slowly reached up and adjusted his silk tie. He placed his heavy hands flat on the edge of the dining table and pushed his chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the floor. He stood up to his full height, his broad shoulders squared and his chin held incredibly high. He did not walk toward his weeping, frantic wife. Instead, Winston walked slowly and deliberately down the entire length of the long mahogany table. He walked right past Dominique, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her napkin. He walked past Uncle Leon and Aunt Patrice, who watched him with wide, shocked eyes. He stopped only when he reached my end of the table. My father turned around and stepped firmly to my side, physically aligning himself with me. He placed a warm, incredibly heavy hand on my shoulder, a silent, powerful gesture of absolute solidarity that brought a sudden, unexpected sting of tears to my own eyes. "I will not stop her," Beverly Winston declared, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, unshakable finality that commanded the entire room. "Because I am completely done protecting a monster." Beverly gasped sharply, physically recoiling as if she had just been struck across the face. "You demanded loyalty while practicing absolute deceit." Winston continued, his eyes locked fiercely onto the woman who had ruined his financial legacy. "You expected absolute submission from this family while you secretly committed federal felonies behind closed doors. You destroyed my credit, you stole my generational home, and you emotionally terrorized my youngest daughter simply because she refused to be as superficial and empty as you are." Winston reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek white legal envelope and tossed it casually onto the center of the dining table. It landed perfectly between the spilled red wine and the ruined roasted turkey. "I met with my own attorney yesterday morning, immediately after leaving the bank manager's office," Winston announced, dropping the ultimate crushing hammer onto Beverly's shattered reality. "I have officially filed for divorce. I have already provided my legal counsel with the comprehensive evidence of your severe financial infidelity, the forged loan documents, and the detailed records of the emotional abuse you actively inflicted upon Zuri." Beverly stared at the white envelope as if it were a highly venomous snake. Her entire body began to tremble so violently that her heavy chair rattled against the hardwood floor. "You will not get a single dime of alimony," Winston stated, his voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or affection. "My lawyers are actively working in tandem with the federal authorities to ensure that you assume absolute total liability for the $1.5 million fraudulent debt. You are completely on your own, Beverly. I am washing my hands of you entirely." The absolute annihilation of their elite facade was finally complete. The devastating reality crashed down upon my mother and my sister with the crushing weight of a collapsing skyscraper. They had absolutely nothing left. Dominique had lost her imaginary Buckhead mansion, her fake luxury lifestyle, and was legally bound to a blacklisted broke felon who had completely humiliated her in front of the entire family before being thrown into a freezing rainstorm. Beverly had lost her stolen generational wealth, her powerful husband, and her prestigious standing in the elite Atlanta community. The wealthy extended relatives she had spent decades trying to impress were currently sitting in profound judgmental silence, actively recording her ultimate downfall on their cell phones. She was facing impending federal criminal charges for wire fraud and severe identity theft, and she had just been publicly stripped of her only remaining shelter. Their reputations were entirely annihilated. Their bank accounts were completely empty. Their husbands were either gone or actively filing for divorce. I looked down at the two broken, weeping women. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no hesitation. I simply felt the clean, brilliant clarity of absolute justice being served. I slowly raised my left arm and tapped the bright digital screen of my Apple Watch. The screen illuminated the dark corner of the dining room. "It is currently 8:15 in the evening," I announced, my voice cutting through the sounds of their frantic sobbing. "I have a private security team waiting in a vehicle at the bottom of the driveway. They are highly trained professionals, and they are fully prepared to secure my new property." I laced my fingers together and offered my mother and my sister one final freezing smile. "You have exactly 60 minutes to pack whatever cheap, legally acquired belongings you can fit into a single suitcase. If you are not completely off my premises by 9:15, I will instruct my security team to forcefully escort you out the front doors and into the pouring rain. Your time starts right now." I kept my eyes locked on the digital screen of my watch, watching the seconds begin to tick away. For a fleeting moment, nobody in the grand dining room dared to move a single muscle. The absolute finality of my declaration hung heavily in the suffocating air. Then the brutal reality of their complete destruction finally penetrated their thick, arrogant skulls. Beverly let out a horrifying, guttural shriek of pure panic. She scrambled frantically to her feet, knocking her heavy custom wooden dining chair violently backward onto the polished hardwood floor. Dominique followed right behind her, tripping clumsily over the wet hem of her least pink designer dress. They shoved past each other, scrambling toward the grand, sweeping staircase, with the sheer, unadulterated desperation of rats fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. I remained seated comfortably at the head of the mahogany table, taking a slow sip of my red wine while listening to the frantic thud of their expensive heels pounding heavily against the upstairs floorboards. I turned my attention calmly to the extended family members still sitting frozen at the table. Uncle Leon was the first to break the trance. He stood up sharply, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket with a look of profound, unfiltered disgust, directed entirely at the ceiling where my mother was packing. He gestured firmly to Aunt Patrice, who was already rapidly gathering her expensive leather purse and aggressively wrapping up the sweet potato pies she had brought. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the criminal radioactive mess my mother had intentionally created. One by one, the aunts, uncles, and cousins stood up in silent agreement. They packed up their coats and personal belongings, entirely eager to escape the collapsing empire. Suddenly, Beverly came rushing back down the grand staircase, her hair disheveled and her pristine makeup ruined by frantic sweat. She had a cheap nylon duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She saw the extended family heading straight for the front double doors and completely abandoned her remaining pride. She lunged forward, grabbing Uncle Leon directly by the sleeve of his suit. "Leon, please," Beverly begged, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "You have to let Dominique and me crash at your place tonight. Just for a few days until I can sort this ridiculous misunderstanding out. We have absolutely nowhere else to go." Uncle Leon stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at her grasping fingers, then looked directly into her terrified eyes. He forcefully yanked his arm away, breaking her grip with zero hesitation. "You committed federal wire fraud and stole from my brother Leon," stated his booming voice, echoing coldly through the grand foyer. "You destroyed this family legacy for a country club membership. Do not ever call my phone or approach my property again. You are entirely dead to me, Beverly." Aunt Patrice refused to even look at her sister. She simply shook her head in sheer revulsion and walked right out the front door, stepping out into the pouring rain. The rest of the extended relatives followed closely behind, actively ignoring Beverly's frantic, hysterical pleas for mercy. They marched out into the night, getting into their vehicles and driving away permanently, severing all ties with the disgraced matriarch. Beverly fell to her knees in the center of the foyer, weeping loudly, as the absolute social isolation she had always feared became her permanent reality. Upstairs, the sound of glass breaking and hangers snapping filled the house. 10 minutes later, Dominique appeared at the top of the landing. She was dragging two cheap, mismatched suitcases down the carpeted stairs. The zippers were straining violently against the sheer volume of clothes she had desperately shoved inside. Her face was streaked with running mascara, and she was panting heavily from the physical exertion of packing her entire fake life into two bags. As she reached the bottom landing, Dominique paused. Her greedy eyes locked onto a massive original oil painting hanging securely on the wall of the foyer. It was a highly valuable heirloom piece my father had purchased at an exclusive auction decades ago. I watched from the archway of the dining room as her desperate brain calculated its pawn value. Without a second thought, Dominique dropped the handles of her heavy suitcases and reached up, digging her manicured fingers behind the heavy gilded frame. She intended to rip it right off the wall and steal it on her way out the door. She barely managed to lift the frame a single inch before the heavy mahogany front doors swung wide open. Two massive men dressed in impeccable dark suits stepped smoothly into the foyer, bringing a gust of cold, rainy wind with them. My private security team had been waiting patiently at the bottom of the driveway for my exact signal. They moved with terrifying, calculated speed. The lead security officer stepped forward, grabbing Dominique's wrist firmly but professionally, pulling her hands entirely away from the valuable painting. "Step away from the artwork, ma'am," the officer commanded, his voice, a low, threatening rumble that provoked absolutely no argument. Dominique shrieked, stumbling backward and crashing into her own suitcases. Beverly scrambled to her feet, gasping in shock as the two towering security guards took absolute control of the foyer. I walked slowly out of the dining room, my hands clasped elegantly behind my back. I stopped right next to the painting, looking down at my sister, who was now cowering on the floor. "Did you really think you could steal from my property on your way out, Dominique?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure freezing ice. You are already married to a blacklisted felon. Do not add grand larceny to your own rapidly growing rap sheet. I gestured sharply to the security guards. Check their bags, I ordered. Beverly and Dominique screamed in protest, but it was entirely useless. The security team efficiently unzipped the overstuffed suitcases right there on the foyer floor. They meticulously removed several expensive silver candlesticks, two crystal vases, and a velvet box containing my grandmother's vintage pearls that Beverly had secretly tried to smuggle out. I watched them confiscate the stolen goods, leaving my mother and sister with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever cheap garments they had managed to pack. Zip the bags back up, I instructed the guards once the stolen items were secured. It is exactly 9:15. Escort these trespassers off my private property immediately. The security guards grabbed the handles of the suitcases and marched straight out the front doors, tossing the bags carelessly onto the wet pavement of the driveway. They turned back and pointed sternly toward the exit, ordering Beverly and Dominique to leave the premises. The storm outside was absolutely raging. The sky was pitch black, torn open by bright, jagged flashes of lightning and deafening cracks of thunder. Freezing torrential rain poured relentlessly from the heavens, creating deep rushing rivers of muddy water across the paved driveway. Beverly and Dominique hesitated at the threshold, staring out into the brutal, unforgiving weather. They looked back at me one last time, their eyes filled with a mixture of profound hatred and absolute devastating defeat. They had no leverage left. No money, no power, no allies, and no fake prestige to hide behind. I simply crossed my arms and stared right back, offering absolutely zero mercy. Slowly, painfully, they stepped out into the raging storm. The walk of shame was spectacular. They trudged down the long, sweeping driveway, the freezing rain instantly soaking their expensive leased designer dresses. Their perfectly styled hair flattened against their skulls, and the mud splashed aggressively against their bare legs. Beverly slipped twice, her expensive heels sinking deep into the wet dirt, forcing her to abandon them and walk completely barefoot on the cold asphalt. They grabbed their heavy suitcases from the ground and dragged them awkwardly through the puddles, the wheels getting stuck in the mud, forcing them to carry the dead weight. They reached the heavy iron gates at the very end of the property, just as a vehicle pulled up to the curb. It was not a luxury black car. It was not a private chauffeur. Dominique's leased luxury SUV had been officially repossessed that very morning. Instead, a beat-up rusted sedan with a flickering headlight pulled up alongside them. It was the absolute cheapest Uber available in the city. I watched from the safety of the house as they aggressively shoved their muddy suitcases into the tiny trunk. They climbed into the back seat of the cheap sedan, completely soaked to the bone, their flawless high society illusions permanently destroyed. The rusted car sputtered slightly before pulling away from the curb, carrying the golden child and the abusive matriarch away into the dark, unforgiving night. The heavy mahogany doors closed with a soft, definitive click, shutting out the howling wind. I turned around to find my father, Winston, standing quietly in the center of the foyer. He looked exhausted, the deep lines on his face reflecting the heavy emotional toll of the evening. But as he looked around the quiet, peaceful house, free from the screaming, the manipulation, and the toxic abuse, a genuine, undeniable sense of relief washed over his features. The heavy burden he had carried for 35 years was finally gone. We walked together in comfortable, companionable silence out onto the grand covered back porch. We leaned against the wooden railing, looking out over the sprawling backyard. The violent storm was finally beginning to break. The heavy dark clouds slowly parted, allowing the bright clear light of the full moon to reflect beautifully across the wet grass. The deafening thunder rolled away into the distance, replaced by the incredibly peaceful, soothing sound of the remaining raindrops falling gently from the leaves of the ancient oak trees. Winston took a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh, rain-washed air. He turned his head slowly, looking at me with a mixture of profound pride and deep fatherly affection. He reached out and rested his hand warmly on my shoulder. So Winston asked, his deep voice breaking the peaceful silence of the night, "What are you going to do with this massive house?" Terrence stared at the crumpled piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake. The smug, untouchable aura he had been projecting all evening evaporated in a fraction of a second. A sickly ashen gray washed over his features, completely draining the warmth from his skin. Sweat beaded on his forehead under the bright glow of the dining room chandelier. Panic, raw and unfiltered, flared in his eyes. With a sudden, desperate jerk, he lunged forward. His heavy mahogany chair scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor, producing a sharp screech that echoed through the room. He reached his hand out, his fingers trembling frantically, trying to snatch the declined receipt off the table before the truth could be exposed. How was not fast enough. Dominique, whose perfectly contoured face had already shifted from confusion to suspicion, moved with lightning speed. She snatched the paper right out from under his grasping fingers. She held it up, her manicured nails gripping the edges tightly. Her eyes scanned the printed text, taking in the cheap motel name, the Tuesday night timestamp, and the brutally declined status of his supposed platinum card. The elegant high society smile she had worn all night shattered instantly. She slammed her hand on the table, her voice rising an octave as she demanded to know exactly what this meant. She screamed at him, asking why his card was declined for a $60 motel room on a Tuesday night when he had explicitly told her he was at a late-night executive strategy meeting. She shook the receipt in his face, her pristine image cracking as hot tears of humiliation threatened to spill over her expensive makeup. Terrence stumbled backward, stammering a string of pathetic, incoherent excuses. He frantically waved his hands, claiming it was identity theft, a bank error, a massive corporate misunderstanding. I did not let him finish spinning his web of lies. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, resting my hands in my lap, and looked directly at my sister. He has not changed one single bit, Dominique. I stated, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the room with absolute freezing clarity. 4 years ago, while I was working double shifts to pay off his massive student loans and keeping a roof over our heads, he thanked me by bringing you into my bed. He cheated on me with you. You thought you stole a prize, but you only inherited a parasite. Now history is simply repeating itself. I paused, making sure every extended family member at the table was listening carefully before delivering the final devastating blow. I was not at a corporate board meeting on Tuesday night. He is currently sleeping with a 22-year-old bottle girl who works at a downtown club. That is exactly who he took to that cheap motel, and his card was declined because he is completely broke. He is drowning in debt, playing you for an absolute fool, and using your credit to fund his miserable lifestyle. Dominique gasped loudly, dropping the receipt onto her porcelain dinner plate, as if the paper had physically burned her. She covered her mouth with both hands, a choked sob escaping her throat. She looked at Terence with sheer horror, recognizing the exact same cowardly, guilty expression he had worn 4 years ago when I caught the two of them together. The entire dining room erupted into shocked whispers. Aunt Patrice clutched her chest, utterly scandalized, while Uncle Leon shook his head in deep disgust. The glorious illusion of Dominique and Terence's perfect relationship was burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. Suddenly, my mother Beverly slammed both of her fists violently onto the mahogany dining table. The silverware rattled loudly against the plates. She absolutely refused to accept this massive public humiliation. She refused to let her golden child be reduced to a weeping, betrayed wife in front of her judgmental relatives. Beverly marched around the table and fiercely positioned herself right between Terence and Dominique, acting as a loyal shield for a cheating fraud. "You are a bitter, jealous liar, Zuri," Beverly shouted, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face. Her chest heaved with uncontrollable rage. "You fabricated this entire ridiculous story because you simply cannot stand seeing your older sister succeed where you so miserably failed. You printed out a fake receipt just to cause drama. You are deliberately trying to ruin our perfect black family image out of pure spite." My mother paced aggressively around the dining room, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch as she tried to control the collapsing narrative. She forcefully ordered the extended family to completely ignore my factual accusations. She vehemently insisted that Terence was an upstanding, highly respected man in the affluent Atlanta community. She loudly claimed that a man of his incredible corporate stature would never stoop so low as to cheat in a rundown motel. She weaponized their fake prestige, desperately trying to blind the family with promises of elite status. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Beverly screamed, pulling a sobbing Dominique into a tight, highly protective embrace. "Terrence is about to be named vice president of Vanguard Financials. They are closing on a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead next week. They are officially entering the absolute highest tier of Atlanta society, and nobody is going to drag them down. Especially not a miserable, jealous sister who cannot manage to keep a decent man for herself." Beverly was completely unhinged, doubling down on her toxic delusions to protect her own social standing. Even if Terrence made a tiny mistake, a strong, high society woman knows how to look the other way to protect the ultimate financial prize. Beverly continued spitting the terrible words right at me, exposing her twisted values to the entire room. Men of his elite caliber have options, and Dominique is smart enough to secure her bag, regardless of a few minor indiscretions. "We are a family of extreme wealth and power. We do not let peasant behavior break our legacy. You are actively trying to sabotage the greatest real estate achievement this family has ever seen, but you will not succeed." I sat perfectly still, listening to my mother scream her desperate, pathetic delusions. I watched her cling so tightly to a fake, heavily manufactured image of immense wealth. She was willing to let her own daughter be publicly humiliated and financially abused, all for the sake of bragging rights at her country club and a glossy photograph in front of a mansion. She cared absolutely nothing about Dominique's broken heart or shattered trust. She only cared about the Buckhead estate. I felt absolutely no guilt for what I was about to do. I was entirely ready to burn her toxic kingdom down to the foundation. I leaned forward gracefully, resting my arms elegantly on the polished table. I looked directly at Dominique, bypassing my mother's frantic tantrums entirely. My voice dripped with absolute freezing ice, silencing the entire room. "About that spectacular Buckhead mansion," I said smoothly, my tone completely unbothered by the screaming that had just occurred. "What was the exact address again?" Dominique wiped her tears aggressively. Even in the midst of her heartbreak, her lifelong conditioning to be superior kicked in. She was fiercely defensive of her imaginary wealth and eager to prove me wrong in front of everyone. She lifted her chin high, squaring her shoulders to look down at me one last time, completely unaware of the trap she had just willingly walked right into. She proudly recited the prestigious address, emphasizing the exclusive zip code to ensure everyone heard it. I did not blink. I reached calmly into my black leather purse. I pulled out a heavy, jingling set of brass keys. I lifted my hand and dropped them squarely onto her fine porcelain plate. The loud metallic clatter echoed sharply throughout the dead-silent dining room, signaling the absolute destruction of their fake empire.